Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. On Monday night, the American people witnessed a Super Bowl of a presidential debate, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. It was fiery and contentious. Today, two of my favorite political wise men, David Birdsell and Hank Scheinkauf, will dissect the debate and speculate on its aftermath. David Birdsell is Dean of the Austin W. Marks School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College and an expert on presidential debate. Dr. Hank Scheinkauf is president of Scheinkauf Communications Limited and a national and international political, public affairs, and corporate media consultant for over 35 years. Thanks, gents, for coming. And as Dave Matthews put it, there is so much to say. Let's start with you, David. Who won? But more importantly, what criteria do you use to assess the winner of the debate?
Well, I always resist calling a single winner of a debate unless there's just an absolute blowout, because people can achieve good things in terms of their electoral strategy, both of them at the same time, or lose both of them at the same time. Last night, I thought that Hillary Clinton cleared the most important bar that was set for her. The bar was pretty high. She was supposed to perform brilliantly in terms of policy depth, knowledge, ability to respond, and the question was, could she turn that into a coherent case for a candidacy, and I think even more importantly, in the coinage of Barack Obama when he was a candidate in 2008, could she prove that she was likable enough? And I think she got over that bar, the only one for her for that evening. I think Donald Trump also sailed over a bar of his own. That bar was much lower. The question was, would he alienate his existing support, which is pretty strong support? I don't think that happened last night. I think he stays in the game, but I think that Hillary Clinton accomplished more in terms of moving her candidacy forward last night.
Hank?
I think that Secretary Clinton solidified the people that are with her, but did not grow the place where she needs to grow, which is
Trump.
White men. And I think Trump solidified that base and moved it a little bit further. Why? He talked to them. He was very specific in the things he said. He chose themes that were directed to his base and to those who were thinking about being with him. Trump's job was not to get more of Hillary Clinton's votes. Trump's job was to get more white men to turn out. And I think he achieved that.
What was the single most best moment for Clinton in the debate?
She had a couple of good moments in the debate. I think that the Trump tax return moment was extraordinary for her. I think toward the end of the debate, when Lester Holt asked the question about looking presidential, which he tried to turn into a stamina question, she got to unload all of her anti-women thing. And I think one of the audiences that Trump would certainly like to get back in some dimension is suburban women who went for Mitt Romney in 2012. He made no inroads in that regard and may actually have kept them safely in the Hillary fence left.
How did he not reach them?
He rehearsed old themes that we know to be provocative, continuing to insult Rosie O'Donnell, not necessarily trying to show any empathy. He was a little bit better on this in a clearly Kellyanne Conway moment in the first 15 minutes of the debate, but that eroded after that point with the overtalk, with the wrong, the shouted out responses to what she did. I don't think that's going to go over well with that demographic.
What about the interruptions, the visual image, the split screen, I think was really important there. Did that hurt among the suburban women?
I think that David's correct, and I think it did hurt. But I would argue the following: that one more shooting, one more mass shooting, one more terrorist attack, it won't matter. There's a very simple problem. Even liberals don't like to get blown up. It's very simple, fact of life. Suburban women would like to do what they think is appropriate, and Trump is turning them off, but he's also, and events around the world are turning them on. And that is the problem that both candidates face.
So the issue is personal insecurity, both domestically and foreign policy, and economic insecurity.
It's always been the same in this cycle. It's personal insecurity and financial insecurity. They are meeting. Whether, in fact, the economy is better or not is not the question. It's what people perceive. In an age of higher expectations and lower performance, we know what occurs. People respond in particular ways, and that's why they respond in this way.
David.
Well, and when we talk about personal insecurity, one of the things that neither candidate is saying is how they're going to guarantee personal security, either on a global scale or on a local scale. There's some more detail from Hillary Clinton, but a lot of it is, a slightly amped up version of Obama administration policy in the Middle East, particularly. Donald Trump, you get sort of a zigzag approach with a lot more aggression in some regards, but also, and I was surprised that this wasn't focused on a bit more last night, blowing up the Atlantic Alliance on the security front, blowing up the Bretton Woods and beyond agreements that control global trade. There's a tremendous amount of risk there, but it requires someone, and it has to be Hillary Clinton to do it, to make this make sense to rank and file voters, because they don't know Bretton Woods.
Didn't she begin to address that by the lecture on Don't Words Matter and pointing to foreign leaders and Trump's statements as being contrary to that?
Well, I think that's true, but you're assuming that people are going to apply that to the issues that we're talking about right now, and I don't know that that equation was made in the debate.
Data's pretty clear that foreign policy generally overall does not impact on outcomes in presidential
candidates. Won't it, given that it's one of the prime issues?
What is impacting is people in this country, a Christian nation, seeing other Christians have their heads taken off in the Middle East by terrorists. Very different issue. And the abuse of women by the same people doing those acts. That's impactful. Trump, unfortunately, is the receptacle for those kinds of fears. She can talk about Bretton Woods, which is critical, but the average American won't get it. What they do get in an age of diminished expectations about their job lives and about those social networks in the Midwest, including church and other functions, just breaking down, what they do get is a sense of America not performing as they believe America should perform. And they can't get it. You can't get Bretton Woods into a 12-second bite. It's just not hard. It's not easy to do.
And picking up on what Hank is saying here, I think there's a way in which Trump channels visceral outrage around these issues, where Hillary Clinton, even if we believe she's right, telegraphs a kind of pragmatic, workman-like approach to how we solve these problems. And I'm not sure that people want to let her get to that point until they see the outrage and are confident that she'll take that forward.
I agree with that entirely. Look, propaganda, basic theories about propaganda haven't changed in 60 years. We know that people respond in particular ways and they have a predisposition. What Trump is sounding like, if you're doing content analysis of his words, is like a very nationalistic populist who is effectively saying America's been stabbed in the back by the elites running the country and by overseas nations. And that is a theme for people who are feeling some sense of desperation, who are feeling the sense of insecurity that tends to work. If we look at what has gone on in Europe for the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, and what is now going on in America, and by the way, what is going on in democracies all over, and what occurred in pre-war Europe. I'm not talking about Nazis, I'm talking about before the Nazis.
Yes, I mean, it's reminiscent of the situation in the 1920s.
Yep, absolutely.
And before that, the election of 1896 with the populist revolt.
No question. Look, you had proto-fascist dictatorships and corporatist dictatorships functioning under the guise of something else in Europe in the late 20s. You had, I'm sure Professor Birdsell can address this, but in 1896, in that election, you had populism joining joining an industrial revolution, joining the beginning of organized labor and social movements in this country at one particular moment where all that came together with the Depression, and the end result was, guess what?
Right.
And all the imagery of the Gilded Age.
Absolutely.
When we're right back there today.
Okay.
Correct.
Now, what was Trump's best moment? It seemed to me that the first 20 minutes, he spoke about economics, trade. He was right on target. He was defining economics as aspirational and everything. And then all of a sudden, he just died.
Well, I think Yeah, rather than point to a single moment, I'd point to a period.
Yeah.
I agree that top of the program, the first 15 minutes, was the time that he was strongest, in part because she was least sure-footed
Yeah,
during that
yes.
period. Whenever he had an unanswered attack, for example, on the super predator line, which she did not address in any way, it's curious to criticize the use of the term super predator when you called for the execution without trial of the people arrested, as we know later, falsely in the Central Park jogger case. But she didn't come back with any of that material. And to the extent that she doesn't respond, that stuff sticks. It may stick anyway, but if she doesn't respond, it sticks.
Coming out of the debate, what has to be done by Trump and what has to be done by Hillary? Did the debate change anything? Did it just solidify the pro-Clinton people and the pro-Trump people and leave the undecideds undecided?
Well, I think there was plenty here for partisans of both candidates to liken what they saw in their candidates, so they probably feel more comfortable with their choice. I'm guessing, and I think Hank and I differ a little bit on this one, if there were undecideds, that you probably got a little bit more pickup on the Hillary side than on the Donald side. But we'll see how that turns out in coming days.
Right.
There's another debate coming up on October 9th, and I think one of the things we have to try to suss out, and I don't know how you do that. How is Donald Trump going to respond to it's sort of a light consensus media opinion that Hillary Clinton had a good night.
Yeah.
Does he decide that he needs to crank up the attacks? Does he use that line that he said he was going to use, that he felt ultimately he couldn't, which was probably about Bill Clinton's infidelities, but who knows? Does he go on the attack in ways that he did not this evening, although there were plenty of sallies, or does he become more like the Donald Trump of the 15 minutes? And to a certain extent, this is going to be a Bannon versus Conway conversation in the campaign.
Yeah, Bank.
I think that he solidified his base. I think the incessant discussion about, he kept mentioning the appropriate words, Pennsylvania, Ohio,
Yeah.
NAFTA. No, you're talking about parts of the country that have been completely destabilized, the entire way of life taken apart, and they blame NAFTA. He went right to the base, and I think he held on to that base. What is David is very, very correct about, I think, is those suburban women, and that's where Trump really failed and needs to figure out how to get some of them back. But by the way, how many white men does he need? You got to win 40%. She's got to win 40% in order to win this thing. And they're in states where she's not doing terrifically well. I also think, Doug, it's important, and I hope David would agree, to follow the Senate races, the ones that are in play. If you look at Ohio, where Portman, the incumbent, was in very serious trouble 3 months ago.
up.
Now he's up 20. I mean, some ridiculous number, maybe not 20, but above the 10 range.
Yeah.
He was down 20 coming in. It's over, probably. If you look at the Senate race in Pennsylvania, where Toomey should have been dead, he's certainly come back to life. And that's a function, I believe, of Western Pennsylvania turnout, which is in a ratio of 2-1 over the East. There's something going on that we haven't seen in quite some time. That is, I don't know if it's relational to what the candidates are doing, but it's certainly relational to what they're saying. And it is in a very targeted fashion. I think Trump is much more visceral than Secretary Clinton. And what Secretary Clinton is trying to do is to ask others to become less visceral. That's very hard to do in the last 5-6 weeks of a campaign.
Response?
Well, one of the other difficulties that we have is a dynamic of widespread distrust of authority. So it becomes very difficult to address Trump's weaknesses. And if you think of, and I believe that this is true, that Clinton's absolutely single greatest weakness is her high levels of public distrust. She can't address that credibly on a stage except performatively. It almost has to be done by surrogates. And it's very late in the game. It's also very late in the game to have somewhere between 12 and 15% undecideds among many of the demographics that are going to be critical for this election. That means it's still up for grabs. I agree the Senate races interact here in interesting ways. And one of the things that I would also think about is, did each of the candidates make their Senate candidates on down ballot more comfortable embracing them, or at least not actively shoving them away as we move toward November?
Did he succeed in assuaging their anxieties about him?
I don't think so, but I think it's kind of they're related to some of the issues that he is discussing. I mean, what is really going on here, I think, in some ways, and what is definitional of the cycle itself, is that, in America, we've always in campaigns and presidential campaigns most frequently said, hey, we're looking for move forward, have change, have direction, because we know the research is pretty clear. Successful presidents and successful candidates break from the past. What's happening here is the people who are the most interesting and the most dynamic are a 70-year-old independent from a state where dairy price supports are very, very significant and guns are allowed, okay? Who talks about socialist left-wing issues, who's 74 years old, and a close to 70-year-old billionaire developer from New York, and a woman who's been on the stage for 40 years. This is not new or fresh at all. And the difference here is that Trump, for better or worse, and I'm not, regardless of my own feelings, brings a freshness and a newness to this whole discussion, and an era of gossip and entertainment. He absolutely fulfills all of that. Absolutely.
Let's talk about the structure of the debate, the camera angles, for example, and the split screen. What impact did the split screen have on perceptions of the debaters?
Well, split screen, obviously, in a structural sense, gives you the opportunity to see how a candidate reacts to the other candidate's salvos. Donald Trump showed much more distaste last night for what he heard from Hillary Clinton, frowning, mewing, oftentimes expostulating in response to this. I thought that Hillary Clinton, and clearly heavily coached for this, did a pretty good job of keeping a relatively sunny face on some of her responses, laughing without making that seem uncomfortable. She seemed relatively natural. I watched this debate with 200 people from Baruch College, students, alumni, and members of the community. And there were a number of young millennial women in the room. And they said that they thought she seemed more relatable after this debate. All of them had been Bernie Sanders supporters. And they thought, I can imagine voting for Hillary now. I couldn't imagine before watching this debate. So she may have made some moves last night. I think the split screen was actually an important part of that.
Split screen helpful to Hillary, not helpful to Donald Trump. Television is still a medium where sharp moves and gestures overall become much more accentuated. And I think Trump failed to understand the nature of the split screen, and I think Secretary Clinton did.
Okay, what about the early commentary? Let's move up. I mean, the debate is really the actual event, the 90 minutes, then it's the spin room, then it's, the news commentary. What about the early commentary? Which way is it going?
Well, let's put the early commentary into at least two buckets, and we have to do that post-2012. And that's early commentary, meaning in the debate, who's tweeting about what and calling attention to what. Famously, the first debate in 2012 was called by Ben Smith 43 minutes in. And at that point, you could see the elite press corps essentially ceasing to watch the debate and then struggling to lead the storyline for the next day. We didn't see as much of that last night. Of course, there was a lot of activity on Twitter, but I don't think there was a consensus at any point in the same way that there was a consensus 43 minutes in 2012. We do know from past studies that even if a person watches a debate from beginning to end and then turns on the talking heads, that the repetition of video segments and of the analysis will ultimately displace whatever that viewer thought during the debate itself. So it's enormously important, and that importance extends not just for the first 24 hours, but probably 48 to 72 hours as we cement popular wisdom about what a candidate achieved and what that says about his or her ability to be president or to win in November.
Now, at the end of this 48 to 72 hours, will the initial perceptions change? Speculate.
I don't like speculating, but I would argue that that for some, the initial perceptions will change. But the press corps is pretty defined as well. I mean, they're really not as significant as they used to be. One of the things that's happening in this election, just as an aside, is that television as a medium is dying. We're coming to the conclusion of the great television age that really began with the Kennedy and Nixon debate and is now concluding. People are getting their information from many different sources. So television as a definer is concluding, and people don't trust what they see on the screen overall. I think what's occurred here is that those who love Trump, as David said before, are going to love him. Those that loved Hillary are going to love him. That the undecideds are not dissipating in the way people would think, and that the numbers are as high as they are should be troubling to the Clintons, not so much to the Trumps, because who knows if those undecideds are going to turn out. But I would speculate that people who have not voted consistently, what we call non-high-propensity voters, are going to come out in states we don't think they're going to come out. And
who are they going to come out for?
Donald Trump.
Okay.
That's because the insurgent tends to get those kinds of votes. And frankly, the way this campaign has been defined by the press corps,
Right.
Donald Trump is the insurgent. And that is not good news for Hillary Clinton, I think.
And Donald Trump is the storyline.
Absolutely.
Right.
He is so much the context and the foreground for
Yes.
this campaign.
Yes.
It becomes very difficult for her to frame messages. She has to respond to a frame that somebody else
Yeah,
creates.
because I mean he is the dominant figure, and overwhelmingly, have we ever seen a more disparate foes than Clinton and Trump, and one dominating the news cycle all the time?
I can't recall anything to this extent, but if you tried to create in a laboratory two candidates who were the polar opposites of one another, you couldn't do much better than what we've got now in terms of demeanor, in terms of policy ideas, in terms of the way that they go about campaigning, in terms of what they appear to want to achieve and think is important. It's really a remarkable contrast, and to a certain extent, they're campaigning almost in parallel, and that Hillary Clinton can win the sort of policy-focused traditional government vote while losing all of the sort of blow it up vote. And the number of times that you hear voters, and people do the anecdotal stories, they
Yeah.
go to Michigan, they go to Pennsylvania, and one or more voters said, I just want somebody who will blow it up or explode the whole thing. If we think back to Brexit, we can't get out of here without Brexit. This is a problem across Western democracies. And the Tories didn't believe, even though their consultants were telling them that they were losing these votes and they needed to explain this in a fundamentally different way. I think Hillary Clinton gets that. The question is it too late in this election cycle to have it make a
How do you
difference?
explain to elites that the very world that they have populated and believe they control and believe they are controlling others with is somehow no longer existing? I mean, again, Western democracies had a discussion about this yesterday with a significant overseas fella, and I said, what is occurring in your country is no different than what's occurring all over the world, and is occurring here. There's the dissatisfaction and the belief that some people, even though they're doing better than their previous generations ever did, have been left out of the equation, both politically, socially, and economically. Is so extraordinary. And this collision of those variables in one place is something we haven't seen for quite some time. And not if ever in the context
Right.
of new communications tools.
Okay. Minor point. The moderator. Was he too intrusive, too laid back, too anti-Trump, too pro-Clinton?
It's going to be so difficult
I
to be
know,
a moderator
I
in this
know.
debate round, and I'm glad that will never fall to me. He had disappeared. He went completely
Yes.
AWOL in the first half of the debate.
Yes.
He consistently allowed Donald Trump to talk over time limits. Trump consumed over 60% of
Yeah.
the entire speaking time in the debate. That was clearly strategic at one level, but that's the kind of thing that a moderator should be able to police. He made very few attempts to do that. When he came after a candidate on a specific question, things you've said before, those questions were asked disproportionately of Donald Trump, not of Hillary Clinton last night. So that's an issue, sort of an imbalance of first half, second half approach in this regard. I don't think any of the questions were illegitimate, perfectly reasonable, but it opens him to charge of bias.
You can't win as a moderator.
You can't.
Who is impartial? I mean, the notion of impartiality is something we've also lost in this particular cycle, because if you're impartial, people presume you're really not, that you really, if you say something, it becomes partisan, because we're in a very partisan and bifurcated kind of political environment that is not reparable, I don't think.
Okay. Go
Well,
ahead,
and I just
David.
want to go back to this question of credibility and trust in institutions. When the Gallup organization, which began in the 1950s surveying trust in government,
Yes.
trust in a number of other institutions, in 1965, it was really quite remarkable. 82% of Americans trusted government to do the right thing all or most of the time. Those numbers are completely flipped. It's 18% today who believe those same things, with the negative over on the other side. If you campaign as the tribune of government, and Donald Trump tried to hang this around Hillary Clinton's neck all during the debate, this notion that you are, what haven't you gotten done in the last 30 years? And then she has to explain why the Secretary of State doesn't get to control everything that happens in government. It makes you look less powerful.
Right.
He's promising a single powerful individual. He cannot plausibly deliver that,
Right.
but that's the promise.
Interesting. I think that's entirely accurate. He can't deliver, and the question I would raise to those who should be thinking about it, like voters, can Donald Trump attract the talent were he to be president that could actually run a government run an effective foreign policy and run a domestic economic policy that would, in fact, cure the ills and evils that he's defining.
Okay, let's move to tactics and strategy. Ground game. It looks like we have a highly intense group motivated by Trump, and to overcome that, Hillary's going to rely on the ground game. What impact does the ground game actually have on an election?
Significant, depending upon the number of undecideds and where the ground game is located. You said to me, Hank, where's it going to matter? I'd say Pennsylvania
and Ohio.
Pennsylvania. No, I think Ohio is a different set of problems, but Pennsylvania, without question. North Carolina, likely.
Yeah.
Okay, Nevada could be a target, depending. I mean, people are viewing Nevada, I think, a little bit right and wrong. They're thinking about it as a Latino bastion. It's really Clark County, Las Vegas is the retirement community for people from the Midwest who couldn't afford to go to Florida. You know, do you want them to come out or not? I think polling will tell you. But right now, North Carolina and Pennsylvania are targets for the Clinton campaign that would help them significantly, and that will probably expand. Ground game, on the ground, to doors, in a very targeted fashion, matching social media to polling data. Pretty good idea.
Who wins that battle?
She does.
Right. Are we in an era? Yeah. Are we in an era of post-truth politics?
I fear we very much are. If no institutions have credibility, if nobody trusts the press, if nobody trusts the Congress, if nobody trusts the government, if nobody trusts academia, and it's not quite that bad, but it's pretty close. Congress has an 8% approval rating at this stage. Then who gets to call out lies and deceptions? It really becomes a matter of, and Donald Trump is prescient in this regard, of brand. And what brand do you wish to associate with in this case? Now, I'm not saying that that means that the election necessarily goes to Trump, but Clinton has to try to figure out how to respond in a way that doesn't rely on institutional authority to credential her positions, because that credentialing is anathema to large segments of the electorate.
You got the last word.
That's why she's in the trouble she's in. George Orwell would look at this in a very interesting way. He'd say, pay attention to social media and watch Big Brother. He's got 12 seconds. And that's really what's going on.
Ooh. My thanks to David Birdsell and Hank Scheinkoff for their savvy insight and thoughtful comments. As a professor, husband, father, and citizen, my last words today: vote, vote, vote. Think about the candidates and vote. Join us in 2 weeks here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.